OCO, I'm so pleased to announce two great ways for Cherokees and our families and friends to reconnect with Cherokee history. First, we welcome the return of the Cherokee Nation Lunch and Learn series. You'll have a chance to participate in person or watch the archived video collection of a series of key topics in Cherokee history. The return of Lunch and Learn is particularly special because it's part of our Black History Month celebration across the Cherokee Nation. In this edition of Lunch and Learn, you'll learn about freedmen history, particularly the celebration of the 1863 Cherokee Nation slavery emancipation. As we work to lift the stain of slavery and the denial of civil rights of freedmen and their descendants, we should all take a moment to understand the history of slavery, emancipation, and today, the full and equal citizenship of Cherokee citizens of freedmen descent. The return of Lunch and Learn comes on the heels of the return of the Cherokee Nation history course. This in-depth and in-person history course is returning to Cherokee communities here on the reservation and at large. It is an excellent opportunity to deepen your knowledge of Cherokee history and share a meaningful experience with family and friends. Keep up with Lunch and Learn and the Cherokee Nation history course at visitcherokeenation.com.
I'm Catherine Foreman-Gray. A lot of you remember me over at the Cherokee Nation. I recently moved over this past year to Cherokee Nation businesses. And so we've started our history classes again. So tonight we're kicking off the history class down in Vian, Oklahoma, with the Vian Community Foundation down there. And so we have classes going on weekly. So if you check Visit Cherokee Nation under events, that's where you're going to find a lot of these presentations that we're doing like this. All right, so I'm really excited for our presenter today. We have Ty Wilson, who is president of the Cherokees for Black Indian History Preservation. I think you've actually you did a Lunch and Learn for us years ago when you had released a book. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that as well. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ty. And again, thank you all for being here.
Hello, thank everybody for coming out. She said something about when this is over, this will never be over, we're going to be here forever, so get comfortable. No, I'm the president of CBIHP. We're Cherokees for Black Indian History Preservation. This subject is near and dear to me because this is the reason why CBIHP actually started. I was raised as a Cherokee. I knew nothing about freedmen history, and I learned this by starting a nonprofit and digging in. One night we had people coming to the neighborhood where I'm from in Tahlequah, Lee Street, asking us questions about being a freedman. And we're like, we don't know what a freedman is. Get out of our neighborhood. What are you talking about? You know. And so we started digging in. Me, my mom, and my uncle started digging in. It's like, what are these people talking about? There was this lawsuit going on at the time, which we knew nothing about. And we soon learned that was part of our history, too, even though we have relatives on both sides, the blood side and the freedman side. We learned that was part of our history, and we was like, well, if we're from here and we don't know, how we expect other people to know about our history? And so as we dug along and tried to find an organization that was telling this part of history and everything, or the history of just Black Cherokees in general, we discovered it didn't exist. So it's like, I looked at them and I was like, well, I guess we're going to have to do it. So at the time I'd moved back home and I was working at Cherokee Nation, and a couple of people pointed me in the right direction and was like, hey, there's places that can help you. There's a community cultural outreach group. And I was like, for real? I've been up there. I work IT. I didn't know what those guys done. And so I went in and they were like, hey, we could help you start your organization. And they did, and within a year and a half, 2 years, we were the biggest nonprofit in Cherokee Nation. We become nonprofit of the year. We done all that stuff, and it was all with the help of CCO. And our then Chief Bill John, he helped out a lot. And everybody pointed us in the right direction, and that's when I met our present chief, Chief Chuck Hoskins, and he was Secretary of State at the time. He was like, anything you need, any help you need, I'll help you out with. We ended up running around this country doing the at-large events, the CCO at-large events, and became friends. And Now, since he's in control, he does a lot of things like this that helps promote our history and our culture, because it's everybody's history, and culture. If you're a U.S. citizen, it's your history and culture. But if you're a Cherokee citizen, it's most definitely your history and your culture, And he's doing everything he can to help us out, because when I first started, I didn't know how I was going to make it work. But with the help of Cherokee Nation, I got to say, it happened. And not to say it wouldn't have happened, but guarantee it wouldn't have happened this fast. So today I'm doing something a little bit different, because this is a new subject that we didn't know about. So we'll start out with, we're all here about the Emancipation Day celebration, the Freedmen Celebration. First, we need to know what a freedman is. Most people hear the term freedman all the time, don't know what it means. A freedman is a former enslaved person who has been released from slavery. That's all it is. Freedman has nothing to do with being Native American or nothing. If you were part of the U.S. and you were enslaved, when they freed you, you were a freedman. So when they got to Indian Territory, the Cherokees, the Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, Seminoles had their freedmen. Us lucky ones, our descendants were the Cherokee freedmen. Lucky because, hey, that's my people, so we're always going to be lucky, but they made it. The Cherokees had already freed their slaves before the treaty, and they made it official during the treaty, right? So it was a different environment where some had fought against the freedom of the slaves. Not that some Cherokees didn't, but it was all made easier to move along. Look at the history of what it took for all of us to get here where we are today. You got to understand, so much has been looked over, erased, and not saved. And then we have people like the guy that helped me out with this presentation, Dr. Dan Littlefield, who is a foremost expert of Native American history, especially Black Indian history, and it's the Sequoia Institute in Little Rock, Arkansas, where he's based out of. And without him, I wouldn't be able to give this presentation today, because he done all the work and done most of the research, so I just went and talked to him. The morning of August 4th, 1876, dawned bright at Tahlequah, Cherokee Nation. At about 9 o'clock, hundreds of people gathered at the Cherokee Freedmen School, south of town. Horsemen and pedestrians formed into a line for a parade. At the head of the group was a horseman wearing a uniform, bearing a sword. At his command forward, they began their processional. All were dressed in their finest clothes. Some horsemen were dressed in uniforms. Among the riders was a man carrying a United States flag. There was a young lady, richly dressed and riding a fine horse. The equestrians sang patriotic songs as the parade moved up the main street to Tahlequah, to the level area surrounding the large spring just north of town. There they were joined by other people who came from all directions to hold the day-long celebration. This event was a celebration known to the freedmen and free blacks of Indian Territory as August 4th, and to the freedmen from the states as Emancipation Day. From the early 1870s until the early years of the 20th century, such events took place more or less with pomp and circumstance on a particular date each year in many towns, villages, and hamlets in Indian Territory. These were annual celebrations that commemorated in part the freeing of slaves in Indian Territory. Ceremonies of days followed similar patterns throughout the territory, but specific variations suggest there were cultural borrowings from tribal groups, especially among the former slaves that were descendants of the 5 civilized tribes. Other practices represent borrowings from the frontiers, 4th of July celebration, and still others have derived from African culture. Whether Juneteenth in the Chickasaw Nation and parts of the Choctaw Nation, or 4th of August in Cherokee, Choctaw, and Creek Nation, they went beyond ceremony and served several purposes. Their coincidence with the campaign seeds of the Indian Territory was fortuitous. They became political media through which freedmen and former free blacks of the tribes could formulate and articulate social, economic, and political goals as citizens and residents to the Indian Territory. Local tribes, politicians, and those running for office used this occasion to air their views and urge freedmen their support for policies or simply to feel social purpose. Just as important, the collaborations were anxiously awaited social occasions, perhaps even the grandest one of this Western freedmen communities. They provide a healthy social outlet for them until near the end of the period when the meaning was lost and the affairs became commercialized and sometimes violent. For the freedmen of Indian Territory, the celebration quickly became a tradition. Those in the Cherokee, the Creek, and parts of the Choctaw Nation celebrated on August 4th, but as early as the mid-1870s, they could not tell you why. Cherokees and Choctaw newspapermen investigated, but the freedmen did not know the significance of the date. Thomas Mayfield, a Cherokee freedman farmer, was once quoted as saying that it was not the date, it was the fact, not the date, that the emancipation was being celebrated. The cuffs were broken, and we stood before the world as free men. That was significant enough reason for us to celebrate. Mayfield was no doubt the type of freedman in Indian country, but there were reasons for the confusion. The so-called 5 civilized tribes had owned approximately 8,000 slaves in 1860. Most of the survivors of the Civil War and their descendants remained in Indian territory as part of the tribe to whom they belonged. Emancipation for these former slaves of each of the tribal nations had occurred at different times. The Lower Cherokees had passed on emancipation in February 1863. The treaties negotiated with the tribes and others proclaimed various dates in 1866 contained provisions that to abolish slavery. The point that confused contemporary observers was that freedmen did not celebrate any date associated with their particular emancipation by the Indians, and that was probably the reason why post-war events in Indian Territory country confused people. The treaties of 1866 had provided for the adoption of free blacks into tribes. Only the Chickasaw successfully resisted adoption of freedmen, who nevertheless remained in the Chickasaw Nation. To native freedmen of various tribes were added thousands of blacks from surrounding states, especially Texas, Arkansas, and Kansas, that began to enter the Indian country in small numbers shortly after the war. But their immigration increased, particularly in the last decade of the century. So by the 1900s, there was over 36,000 blacks in Indian Territory. Throughout the territory, there were black communities whose population consisted of large part of non-native blacks. That impact showed clearly in the celebration of Emancipation Day. Although some freedmen believed that August 4th was the date the news of emancipation proclamation reached the Indian Territory, or the date the respective tribes freed their slaves, it was really the date of emancipation celebration of former slaves of the Bahamas. The practice of celebrating the day probably came to Indian country by way of Kansas, where many of the freedmen had taken refuge during the Civil War and from which they returned in the late 1860s. After Oklahoma opened in 1889, blacks of the territory moved. Many who came from Kansas also celebrated on August 4th. Chickasaw Nation and some of Choctaw Nation freedmen and blacks, many of who were called state blacks from Texas, celebrated Juneteenth. June 19th, the day of the 1865, when General Roberts S. Granger had notified the slaves of Texas that they were free. In 1884, the year following the adoption, the Choctaw freedmen celebrated at Sugar Creek with pageantry. This is one of the bigger celebrations they had throughout Indian Territory. Whatever day Emancipation Day was celebrated, the people anticipated with great anxiety and much industry and enthusiasm. Planners chose a site that made preparations to spread the word, usually through newspapers and by handbills, and they were printed and distributed. There were 3 requirements for an ideal setting for celebration: good water, plenty of shade from the summer sun, and accessibility to the freedmen population. Thus, certain places that met these conditions must ideally become popular celebration grounds. Hendrick Springs at Tahlequah, 4 Mile Creek near Fort Gibson, and Gooseneck Bend on the Verdigris became popular spots in the Cherokee Nation for these events. The celebrations were more elaborate affairs in some communities of Indian Territory than others. Perhaps the most elaborate in terms of organization and ceremonies were those of the Cherokee freedmen of the Eastern and Creek Nations. In these regions, the freedmen adopted a martial organization that named a marshal general, a commander-in-chief of the day. His duties were to coordinate the event and lead processionals. The Cherokee Freedmen of Delaware District formed an association with a president chairman. They divided their equestrians into 2 battalions, each with a colonel, a lieutenant colonel, a captain, a first lieutenant, a second lieutenant, and a color bearer. Instead of a single Emancipation Day queen who presided over the day, the Freedmen of Delaware District had 2, one for each battalion. The officers responsible for seeing the peace was kept, and they presided over the day's formal ceremonies, which included a grand processional and public speaking. The grand processional varied from group to group and from time to time, but was always one of the highlights of the celebration. Here the people could show off their dress, their spirited horses, and their fine regalia. Usually consisted of horsemen. Processionals sometimes took form of parade to the celebration grounds. The marshal with drawn sword led the procession accompanied by a rider carrying a U.S. flag in town. Pedestrians joined the parade. Processionals were more often held on the grounds. It was sometimes a parade through the grounds by the horsemen known as the Army. At Hunts Mills in 1876, the 2 mounted battalions with their queens and maids of honor marched the counter-march 4 or 5 times around a piece of bunting placed on a pretty knoll. The second part of the ceremony throughout Indian Territory was the public speaking. Freedmen speakers were usually preachers, teachers, politicians, and other leaders. Indian speakers could be educators or politicians from the principal chief on down. And white speakers were usually local businessmen married to the tribal members or who had permits to do business in Indian country. The speakers talked about self-help, agriculture, unionism, and economy. Some speakers gave inspirational talks, some gave advice to youth, and others topics such as progress of the Negro, freedom, and unity. Local and national tribal politicians and officials looked at the Emancipation Day celebration as a means of sharing their political views and gathering freedmen support. Whether the principal chief or an educator, these native speakers were sometimes advertised well in advance and were sometimes called upon to give impromptu speeches. Beyond the pomp and circumstance and the pageantry, Emancipation Day celebrations were valuable media through which the freedmen could formulate and articulate their social and economical, political aspirations and goals as citizens and residents of Indian Territory. Throughout the day, while the speaking and other events were going on, the informal activities also took place. The young people played games while the elders visited with one another and reminisced about the old days. There was sometimes entertainment by brass bands and string ensembles. The highlights of informal activities was the meal, a center of which was barbecue, cooked barbecue beef, mutton, and pork, but the favorite by far was the beef. Those in charge of celebrations slaughtered from 1 to several beeves, depending on the expected crowd, and barbecued them over open pits, tended usually by women, while other activities were going on. Occasionally, there was stewed beef. They set a scaffold for temporary tables to hold the beeves and other food, which was unloaded box after box from the wagons of the celebrants. They set up dance platforms on the grounds or held dances at some convenient locations in a nearby town. Perhaps the greatest significance of Emancipation Day celebration was that they were grand social occasions in Western Freedmen community. They were a break from the drudgery of regular farm life. New friends were found, old friends renewed, and lasting relationships formed. The celebrations were opportunities to find out what was happening outside of one's community, for they were all attended and people often long distance, especially after railroad travel became more common. About 500 attended the celebration at Tahlequah in 1876. In the early years, when carrying weapons was common, the gatherings was peaceful. The peaceful was no doubt related to the strict prohibition of alcohol beverages on the ground. When some celebrations fired the pistols at Cane Creek in 1881, officials ordered the event cider vendors shut down. In the Cherokee Nation, the district sheriff was usually on hand. These officers were often supported by U.S. Marshals whose presence had a desired effect. Local reporters who attended the celebrations during the early years were struck by the peacefulness of such large gatherings, one noting in 1876 that not even a cuss word was marred through the day. Part of the success of early celebrations was no doubt the results of efforts of men such as William Brown, a former member of the Cherokee National Council who served on the Marshal as Marshal of the Day for several years before his death in 1893. Cherokee Freedman Brown was a barber, a restaurant keeper, and who had been in business in Muskogee from some time as his founding in 1872. When Brown was liked generally and he was influenced, no doubt, helped to make the celebration run smoothly when he was in charge. Emancipation Day celebrations remained a healthy social outlet until social and political changes in Indian Territory brought about their decline. As time passed, the celebration was marred by increase in violence, whereas an increase in lawlessness in Indian Territory. Also, during the last 2 decades of 19th century, U.S. citizens entered the team by tens of thousands. They were not subject to the jurisdiction of Indian Territory. And therefore, it resulted in a lot of lawlessness. The state was incapable of enforcing its jurisdiction at the time, and the federal courts with the authority of criminal cases was established in Indian Territory in the 1890s. Increase in lawlessness was reflected in the violence that broke out in huge gatherings such as Emancipation Day celebrations. There was a shooting at Blue Creek celebration in 1891 and 2 killings at Gooseneck's Bend Cherokee Nation celebration in 1893. Carrying weapons on the ground, selling whiskey, and fighting became more common, as is the presence of more law enforcement officials. The grounds were fenced, and the horses, which had been such an important part of the pageantry of early celebrations, were now banned from the grounds, as were vehicles of all kinds. In later years of the 19th century celebrations at Tahlequah were held on a party ground nearby the Illinois River. At what was thought to be the last celebration held there, revelers were fired, a horse was killed, and a man was wounded. Other changes indicated the celebrations also became commercialized as time passed. No longer were they simple gatherings at which people shared a picnic, watched pageantry, and listened to speeches. It was now fellowship for a fee. Instead of picnic, barbecues freely shared. Many lunch stands. Railroad capitalized on the event by offering special rates. Technology made an appearance in the form of flying Jennings and swings. Merchants who were set up stands and side tables and swings all were required to pay a license. The range of amusement expanded. There were foot and bicycle races, steer roping, turkey shoots, riders racing horses and purses, and there were baseball games, and the dancing platforms were more commonplace. By the 1890s, Emancipation Day had been expanded to Emancipation Week to give gamblers and hucksters long time to celebrate and separate the freedmen and their cash. By then, there were no longer events that the politicians wanted to attend, but rather avoid. Consequently, they lost their flavor for the political rally. By the end of the century, the celebrations had greatly declined. They had lost the air of Thanksgiving and had taken on the carnival atmosphere. A generation had passed since the treaties of 1866 or the adoption of the 13th Amendment, and fewer of the celebrants had experienced slavery. The significance of the occasion was lost. Many of the present celebrations declined because a sense of community was lost through the years. Thousands of blacks who immigrated to the territory from the United States were placed in a different social class from the freedmen, which made a difference in the environment with the blacks in Indian Territory. There was hostility among the blacks as long as the prejudice of the turn of the century. Finally, the first decade of the 20th century was one of color conscience that tainted the demise of Indian Territory and the birth of the state of Oklahoma. It was a period of growing racism. Racial issues were paramount in election delegates of the Constitutional Convention, at which the debate of insertion of Jim Crow clause took more time than any other single issue. Jim Crow legislation was passed for the first session of the first legislature of the legislation quickly followed. During this time, many blacks were no doubt reluctant to participate in festivals and celebrations that called attention to their race. And the freedmen who considered themselves tribal members were reluctant to have themselves associated with blacks in the public mind. Exactly when Emancipation Day celebrations ceased altogether is uncertain, but they seem to have survived for a longer time in smaller towns. The last one was held in Okemah, Tuskegee area in 1902. One was held in Muskogee at 1909. There was one as late as 1911 in the all-black town of Clearview, Oklahoma, of the Old Creek Nation. Over 2 decades later, old-timers will reflect the celebration and fond memories. As we do, they apparently sense that with the passing of Juneteenth and the 4th of August celebration, Indian Territory, there had been past a colorful and significant part of freedmen history in Indian Territory. Okay, thank you for listening to me read that. So what we must understand is like what happens many times today. Something starts out a certain way and ends up something else. We all have those celebrations that started out one way and becomes commercialized, and then it gets lost in history. And so we grew up not knowing such big pageantry events existed. Has anybody here ever heard of this? Because as a historian, and several other of my historians, it was a big surprise that these things ever existed. And I grew up here, so I thought I knew everything. I grew up in Tahlequah. My people walked the Trail of Tears, came here, helped build the town, and we are the Lee Street people. There's about 20 families from up there, and once a year we usually get together, do a Memorial Day weekend, and have a big celebration because we got people from all over the country that come home. And most of them didn't know they were descendants of freedmen either. Which I shouldn't say that, because if you're black in America, you can pretty much bet you're a descendant of a freedman. Now, which freedman, if it was U.S. freedmen, Cherokee freedmen, Choctaw, whatever. But the problem is that people get that whole freedman thing confused and mix it up. My thing is, nobody today is walking around like we have people that call the Cherokee freedmen freedmen. You know, the Cherokee freedmen existed. They were people that were enslaved. We are the ancestors. We're not freedmen. We're descendants of freedmen. Just like the U.S. people. If you walk up to a black man from the U.S. and tell him he's a freedman, I ain't never been no slave. What you talking about? They're U.S. citizens. Nobody calls them descendants of freedmen or whatever, because they've been citizens forever. About the same time we became citizens. It was just a different country. Our history is a little different because we were born in a different country. How long do you have to live in a country before you become a citizen? You know, how long do your people have to put in their blood, sweat, and tears to build a place before you're considered equal? You know, with the government we have right now, with the people that are in control, like our chief, he grew up with other Cherokees who are descendants of freedmen. He understands our history and culture. He's trying to make other people understand it. That's why we're having things such as this. Because trust, if it was just me running around from Lee Street screaming all this stuff, nobody would care. You know. But I've been put here on this platform, and we try to make it work. Stick Rouse was a slave. In Tahlequah history, they will tell you that Stick Rouse was a full-blood, because at that time in history, being a full-blood only meant that you lived by old Indian ways. So he was a full-blood. Stick Rouse was a prominent businessman. His great-grandson lived on Lee Street and told me his story. So when people would tell me that Stick Rouse was a full-blood Indian, I'd be like, yeah, he was also black. And they would get confused. When you look at history, you got to think in terms of what was then, not now. When you read The Great Gatsby and they tell you that there's a room full of gay people, gay then just meant happy, right? You got to look at it through those eyes. So you got to do the same thing with all of history. You know, Stick Rouse got elected in Tahlequah because it was more than just black Indians that voted for him, right? It had to be. It was Tahlequah. He got a majority. When you bring in the state, when Oklahoma becomes a state, there's more racism that comes in. You get more division, And then by stuff like this, where the history is lost and people don't know their history, don't know there were celebrations of this caliber, don't know that the actual Black Indians were part of the government and all that. Stick Cross wasn't the only one. There was at least 6 more that we know of, and that's what we know of, because people get confused as time goes on. You got to understand, race doesn't really exist. It's a construct made to divide. What most people consider race is really nationality, but in one generation, if you have an Indian woman with a Black man, in one generation, you look like this. This is what you come up with. We don't migrate down. This is what you get. So then, you fast forward 200 years later of my people being mixed, I still look like this, but we've been here. We didn't show up yesterday and decide we want to be Cherokee, because trust me, when I was younger, if I could have been from any place else besides Tahlequah, I would have picked it. Now I love my town, but hell, I'm an old man now, you're supposed to. But it's the way it is. And yes, so those are things that people just don't know about. There was a lot more to stick routes out there, and there's a lot more people that were Black Cherokees that had cards, so they was considered Black Cherokees instead of just freedmen, that also done stuff throughout society. Like the biggest medicine woman of our time was a Black Indian, Miss Lawhead. She was worldwide known before the internet, but she was Black and Cherokee. But people that didn't know that outside just considered her a full-blood, We didn't, as Cherokee people, we didn't have blood quantum. We existed long before the U.S. government came along and gave us blood quantum. That didn't make us, trust and believe. I did not become a historian because I look good. I become a historian because I want to know these things. And I look good, but that's irrelevant. Basically, when you think Juneteenth celebration, it's the one that made it, and everybody forgot about the August 4th celebration. So, which is kind of the reason why I'm doing my symposium that weekend, to let people know about the Indian side of that, and just to let people know about Cherokee history in general. But we're going to talk about that side a lot too, because like I said, I grew up here, and we like to think we know all about Cherokee history, but we don't know nothing. We don't. We really don't. But also we have the exhibit that's coming up. We've done it a couple of times here. We've done it once in town, once in Tulsa, and it's going to Fort Smith. Yes, it's going to start May 10th, 11th at the, what do you call it down there? The U.S. Marshal Museums. But things like that, Cherokee Nation is putting that out so you can see these pieces of history. They're trying to help get this history out because it's being lost. It's being lost, and we're digging it back up, But look for stuff like that, and they're good about advertising it. And if you have any questions, hit cbihp.com. It all comes back to me. There's, like I said, we used to be one of the biggest nonprofits in the nation, and COVID did not like us. It beat us up. We lost a bunch of our elders, one of which I should mention, Jessie Mae Coulter helped me start everything, and we lost her right after that. And she grew up there in the Fort Gibson 4 Mile area and was a big part of me helping track down some history that I knew nothing about. And just people like that, that we've let pass and didn't know the right questions to ask. Now we're stuck digging through paperwork, And the chief did make an announcement at a thing we had, was it last week, earlier this week? My days blend. that we had in North Tulsa down at the Greenwood celebration that, he's not standing for that. He's fighting that, and they're going to treat everybody equal. So he's done that. He's done that, exactly what you're talking about. If y'all don't know what he's talking about, what it is that if you're considered a descendant of freedmen and you get arrested, they're not sending you to tribal jail. They're sending you to state jail. And he's like, no, those are our citizens. We're not going to stand for that. So they are fighting that, and he announced it last week. Because you got to understand, we all was here living in the same spot. It wasn't no magical other part of the tribe where I grew up at. I grew up right in the middle of town. But I'd like to thank you for having me, and I appreciate everything. And we go way back, so it don't count, but she's great people. And without people like her encouraging me and having me doing this, because the people that know me know I hate being up and doing public speaking. You put me in a crowd in the background, I'm good, but you put me up here, I hate it. Thank you.
And I'm sure Ty will stick around a little bit if you have any additional questions for him. I do, again, want to thank everybody. I mean, Shane, Elena, everybody that helped me today set this up. Katie, I don't think she came back over, but she helped me put all those signs outside. So have such a great team of people. I'm so excited that I moved back over to visit Cherokee Nation. So again, if you go to visitcherokenation.com, that's where you're going to find, if you go to the events tab, that's where you'll find all of the information on our upcoming classes. We've got history classes starting. And next month, the Lunch and Learn is going to be Tuesday, March 26th. Again, these are all online, though. If you go to Visit Cherokee Nation, you can find this. It's going to be a panel of Cherokee women. So it's Women's History Month next month. And we'll be talking about the historical role of Cherokee women and what that entails. So we'll have Dr. Candace Teague, who is District 2 Counselor, Elizabeth Toombs, who is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Cherokee Nation, and Kristen Mosier, Senior Manager of Collection and Exhibits. And so I'll be moderating a panel with them to talk about our role as Cherokee women historically and what that meant. So, all right, well, thank you all for being here. Hold on.